All right, so a theory of data viz design. This section is more about attributes, thinking about the different things that you can use in data visualization to, so again, relating back to the science of it to draw the short-term attention, the sensory memory, and so on. So I'm going to start with the definition from Mr. Andy Kirk. He's the author of a couple of books now called Visualizing Data. He's on Twitter. He's been around for, he's one of the early adopters of the world of data visualization. So his definition is a really good one, I think. So he defines it as the representation and presentation of data to facilitate understanding. So let's break that down. Representation in this case, I think, is thinking about how you really choose what chart types you're using for the data. So are you representing it in a bar chart, in a line chart, in a tree map, or so on? Presentation then talks about the various attributes that you're applying to that chart. So are you using color, or are you using size? Maybe you're using opacity or shape to present that data in a particular way within that chart. Data, that's the obvious one. You can't be data. You'd be visualizing anything if there wasn't data. And then the key here is the understanding. And when I've heard Andy talk about it, he refers to understanding as you don't know how the person on the other side of the computer, the other side of the desk is going to understand your visualization. You can do all that you can to kind of narrow that perspective so that they understand it in the way that you want them to understand it, but ultimately they're going to have their own shared frame of reference, the context that they've got from their own experiences and culture. They're going to have their own opinions, and so our job as people that are visualizing data is to present it, represent it in a way that facilitates the understanding that we want to put across. And sometimes it does depend on the form of visualization that you're undertaking, but in the majority of cases, you have done the analysis, you are presenting something that you have found in a certain way, and you want the person on the other end of that to understand it in that particular way. So we'll dive a little bit into those different things. There is at the end of this presentation a little bit of a resources. So there's 5 or 6 different catalogs, including this particular one by the Financial Times. You may have seen something like this before. It's a bit of a chart directory. So when we talk about representation, it's thinking about the types of data that we've got. And one of the questions that often comes up is, how do I define which chart is right for my data? And more often than not, the answer to that question is, well, it depends. You can show your data in several different ways, and each of the different ways will reveal something different to the audience. But luckily, there are things like this that can be really useful for deciding, okay, I've got a part to whole data set, so maybe a hierarchy, and I'd like to find out how that hierarchy, like the size of it in different parts. So how many sales have I made in my subcategories? How many have I made in my category, and what's the proportion of that? And in that case, I would scan across to the part to whole, and I would find a particular way of presenting that or representing it that fits the message that I'm trying to send across. Next thing to this, and this is something that will come up a few times today, is the preattentive features. So these are the things, when we go back to our number 9's graph, this is the ways of encoding data that really attract the sensory memory. Thinking about the size, the shape, the length. So the length is a particularly important one. That is the foundation of the bar chart, the wonderful bar chart. We are very quick and very good at identifying where there are different lengths in bars. And so it's very easy to be able to very quickly understand that we've got the length of a particular bar chart, a particular category, if the next one is smaller, larger, or so on. So here are a list of all the various preattentive features that you can use in your visualizations to denote something that is different, so that the brain can detect a pattern, and they can use their sensory memory to drive the short-term memory to think about what is different about that pattern and why should I be looking at it. The other thing that is really important in data visualization is text and annotation. So Matthias, if you're at the ready, this is actually our final poll for today. Here I've got a chart. I've stripped back all of the text and annotations outside of the x-axis here, and my ask of you is that you tell me what this chart is showing. So I've put up a few options there for you. If we can do our vote. I'll just have some quick water. So usually I'll ask people to shout out answers, and the most common ones that I get are precipitation and the stock price of a company. How are we looking on this? How many people have voted?
50% by now.
Okay, just give it 10 more seconds.
Yep. 5 more seconds, 60%. Okay, closing the poll.
Purchases of chocolate is the winner. Okay, so just very briefly, got a question from Phil. Will the slides be distributed later? This whole thing has been recorded and you will have access to that recording after the call. I should have mentioned that at the start, apologies. So purchase of chocolate, that's what most people have said here. The reason why people often say precipitation is that it's a light blue color. They think about the winter months where there's more precipitation, and the shape of the graph kind of reflects that quite nicely. That is unfortunately incorrect. People also say stock prices because they're used to seeing perhaps line graphs, area graphs represent stock prices of indexes or companies. Purchases of chocolate, I think we've had that one before because there are large spikes before Easter and also before Christmas when you think about maybe chocolate being something that you would buy as a gift for friends and family. So unfortunately, only the people that selected other are correct, and there is no way of knowing whether you will be right ultimately, but I'm just going to bring back the text and annotations to this visualization. So in fact, the chart was showing when people break up according to their Facebook status. Now this data is pretty old now, but it's something that I always quite enjoy the surprise when people see what actually the data is. And the important thing here is thinking about how text and annotations have really been important in showing the user exactly what is going on. So the first thing I want to look at is title here. Really important to have a title to your graph to explain a little bit about the context of what's going on. You've got a little reference to the data source, and then if you skip down here to the bottom right hand corner, you've got a little bit more about the data source. So having somewhere on your dashboard, I often use the bottom right hand corner as somewhere that you put the source of your data is really important for transparency and for giving your users the ability to trust exactly what you're saying in your chart. So if they know where the data source is coming from, then they'll have more trust in the actual output that you're visualizing. Next up, you've got in the bottom left-hand corner attribution. So this was done by David McCandless from Information is Beautiful and Lee Byron as well. And so again, that's a useful piece of information. This is a one-off visualization, but in your dashboards, if you can imagine that, perhaps you want to put a reference to which team it's coming out of. So if you're a particular team in your business, maybe it's worth putting that, or a contact detail, something that will give information to where you can find out more about that dashboard. And then finally, we've got the annotations, and this is what I think turns it from a good chart, quite an interesting chart, into a really, really brilliant one. And that's because you're interacting with it. You're thinking about, it's basically the analyst interpreting the chart and then giving you as the reader a reason to focus on different areas of the chart. So they're looking at the spikes, the peaks there, the troughs. So Christmas Day may be too cruel to break up, although I think there is actually still a few people, according to the data, that do break up on Christmas Day, which is tough. April Fool's Day is quite a funny one. There's a spike on the 1st of April when people might break up as a joke. Maybe that will lead to further breakups in the past, which is why it doesn't jump straight back down. But Yeah, use of the annotation there, really important for driving the reader to understand exactly what they're looking at, why they should look at, and why they should devote their time to that. And this one's got the added bonus of being quite a funny topic with some witty captions as well. Okay, so we're now going to focus very much on color. Lovely picture of some butterflies on here. When should you start thinking about using color? So here I've got an example of Max Verstappen, Dutch racing driver again. I've used color here, but I don't think it's a good use of color at all. There's far too much going on. I mentioned cognitive load, thinking about how many things there are on the color palette here. We've got far too many. It's very difficult to make a comparison between these 2 years. And so I think my first point of color is that it's not always necessary. It's not always necessary to shove color onto everything. Here I've done a quick makeover of this graph, and instead of using color, I'm simply using length. And this is just one way of presenting the data. Perhaps if you wanted to use color for the next time, you might have the individual race and then maybe a bar for 2018 and a bar for 2019, both going out in the direction with maybe 2 colors on the color palette. But either way, that way, this way, it's much easier to see per race how many points he won in this particular one than when we were looking at it when we had just applied lots of color to it. So really important to think, first of all, do I need to use color here? Or can I use a different attribute? Can I use, in this case, length and direction to really highlight where the differences are? Then it comes on to when you are using color. Now, Tableau, by default, will, depending on what type of field you're dropping onto the color, will give you a continuous or a discrete color palette. So when you drop something, a green pill, a continuous variable onto the color palette is going to pop up as a continuous color scheme like this, where you've got a light shade to a dark shade. And in this case, this is what's known as double encoding. So we're using both the length of the bars and also the color of the bars to show the varying range. So this is the number of Grand Prix that were held between 1950 and 1954. So generally, when Tableau sets something as a default, it's because they have thought about it. They have thought about the visual best practices that go behind it. And in this case, that visual best practice is that you're using a continuous color scheme for a continuous variable. On the other hand, if I want to, instead of put wins on here, I want to put perhaps the region, the continent that the races were held in. And in this case, I put a category. And so the color scheme is no longer that continuous blue, the not diverging, the continuous color scale. I've forgotten the name for it now. Whereas in this case, we've got 3 very different colors. They are in a categorical manner. So for each category, we've got a different color. And that is appropriate when you are using categorical data. So if you're dragging a blue field on there, a discrete dimension, then it will automatically default to using a color scheme like this. And that's how it should be. If you've got categorical data, discrete data, then distinct hues of color are important, whereas if you've got a continuous one, then shades are generally the best way to go. Now on to corporate color schemes. So a lot of the companies out there, a lot of people on this call will have strict orders never to diverge from their corporate color branding palettes. And I want to talk through a few examples of where this is done really well, and also an example of where it's done not so well. So first off, I'm just going to briefly flick through a few of these. This was from the Storytelling with Data Challenge. And in here, we've got a few different graphs, and they've been really, really nicely branded using the corporate colors. So in this case, Neil has taken some data and he has visualized it in the way of the Transport for London. So this is the way that the tube map in London looks like, and he's done a really good job of making it feel and look like a tube map to display that data. Next up, we've got Sarah Bartlett, who has visualized this data in the form of Ben & Jerry's, the ice cream manufacturers. And again, she's added in, she's got the color scheme, but she's also added in little extras, little bits that remind us that it's Ben and Jerry's that we're looking at. And then finally here we've got Apple, and this is really clean. This looks like something that they might put on their website. They make these big statements, often with full stops at the end of them. iPhone 10, iPhone but better, that kind of stuff. But again, all three of these use cases have been really nicely branded, and they've used the color scheme, the color palette, and it's worked really well. Now, this was actually part of a project where we had exactly the same data, and people were told to brand this in the way that a company might expect. So you take a company and it produced some really, really cool results, which was interesting to see just how many ways you can present the same data and it feel like a different chart. So I guess the takeaway from this is that you use your colors, use little props, things that are going to be useful, especially when you're publishing something that is externally facing. Think about how you can make it feel like your own brand. But my advice also is never to go over the top with this. Don't overcrowd the stuff with this. So let's now think about an example of where a color scheme might not work. So I mentioned at the beginning that my former employer was Ernst & Young, and they had a particular color palette, which was to do with their color branding. And that was yellow, and I think we had 5 different shades of gray. And that meant that when I was creating charts, they would turn out something like this, where we have yellow at the top, and then it would cycle through all of my grays. And you quickly see that if we think again about attention spans, thinking about the sensory memory, my attention is instantly being drawn to the one color that isn't gray. So it's being drawn to that yellow at the top, Michael Schumacher, because it stands out. It's different. It's not a gray. And we'll come on to why gray is so important in a second. But this really wasn't ideal. So stick to your company color palettes to an extent, but never do it in exchange for thinking about visualization best practices. So the way that we ultimately got around this at EY was to we'd have this color palette for when we really wanted to pick out something in the story. So if we wanted to highlight something, then we'd use our EY yellow and use the rest of the colors as a gray. But if we wanted to not necessarily drive the reader's attention to a particular topic or a particular point, then we would use what was known as the Better Expressions color palette. And in that, there was just a range of different colors that didn't automatically allow one particular color, in this case, yellow, to stand out. So something important to think about there. If you've got a corporate color palette, then stick to it as much as you can, but never use it to flaunt the best practices that we've been talking about today. So to back this up, this is why gray is the most, in my opinion, is the most important color in data visualization, just because of its power to allow other things to stand out. So in this example, gray is just another color. It's not allowing anything necessarily to jump off the page. Whereas if I use it throughout, and another little tip or trick here is to have your title in the same color as the thing that you're pulling out, and then often that means that you don't necessarily need a legend. It makes a bit more space, and you can make that link between the title there and the bar that you're coloring in the same color. But very quickly, if I flick back through these again, in this one, gray is just another color, but in this one, gray is really allowing the color that isn't gray to stand out and be the attention of the sensory memory, and that's what's driving where you're looking at. So when used correctly, gray is extremely powerful just because of the properties that it allows other colors to stand out and to be the focus of the attention. Here's a really nice example of that across an entire dashboard. So this one's done by my good friend Spencer, who decided to take a dual color scheme throughout his whole dashboard. And throughout all of this, you've got your red, which is the focus of the dashboard. It's 3 particular Major League Baseball players throughout of this. And then the rest of it just in the gray. So straight away, your focus is on the red. You can pick out the stuff that Spencer wants you to pick out very quickly. And whereas before we were just looking at a single chart, here is a nice example of how you can do that across your entire dashboard to really draw the focus onto one particular thing. Talking about cognitive load again, limit your color palette. So here is a nice example of where there are far too many colors. You can see down here that there's actually 3 pages worth of a color legend, which is really not necessary, particularly in this graph. We've got 3 really standout categories here. We've got the red, which is Canada, the green, which is not thinking of moving, and we've got the purple, which is back to home country. Everything else, maybe Australia's deserves the same category, but everything else can be bunched into an other category in this particular example. And that means that our color palette from being 3 pages can very quickly be reduced to just 4 or 5 colors, which is really the maximum you should be thinking about using on any particular chart. And finally, no repeated encoding. So I see this quite regularly, which is unfortunate, where you've got the same color but meaning several different things. It's potentially more rare to have it on a single chart. So in this case, we've got for red, both art and paper are red, and so it's impossible to tell which line is this one here and which line is this one down here. So again, useful to think about when you're creating your charts. Don't overcrowd the color scheme, but definitely don't encode the same color to 2 different properties and then not label them, because the user won't be able to pick out which is which. Next up, I'm just going to play a short video now. This is done by Ryan Sleeper, I think, at Playfair Data. And he's put together this nice example of what's called data ink. So thinking about all of the extra non-data related attributes that take up a particular page. So I'm just going to play this video. It's just about a minute. There we go. So really nice video there on data ink. Going to actually touch on the topic of coronavirus here with data ink. So if you've been following the news, you'll notice that a lot of media channels are now turning to data visualization to communicate what's going on with coronavirus in various different countries. So this is one that I saw on the government's talk a couple of days ago, where they were talking about the UK cases of coronavirus. And in essence, this isn't an awful graph. We think about the text and annotations that we were talking about earlier. We've got well, the government's got the most important message there right at the top in yellow, so that very quickly draws the attention. It's got the text that we're talking about here of the source down there as well, where it's being broadcast from the Cabinet Office. A title a little bit more. So in a sense, I understand why the government has done this. You almost expect a little bit from the government to be producing things that are first and foremost informative, can't be misinterpreted, and so they've kind of created something that is a little bit boring, a little bit dull, not exciting to look at. It's also a very sensitive topic. So they've created this particular graph, and it was in and amongst several other graphs, and all of them had this particular theme running through them, that they hadn't really, in my opinion, thought about the data ink that they were using, and a few little things that maybe could have made these a little bit easier to communicate. So the first of these was the grid lines. Now grid lines and axes are really important when you don't have the ability to label your graph, but as soon as you stick the labels on the end of the bars, that is acting as a proxy for your grid line. So here we've got 5,903. I no longer need to know that is just beneath 6,000. I already know that. I know I can work out my numbers. So as soon as you add labels to your bars, best practice is to then remove, in the majority of cases, remove your grid lines, remove your y-axis, because your labels here are acting as the proxy for that. The length of the bar is the quick sensory memory, how big in this case is the number of cases, and then the label here is the precise thing. So we no longer need these axes that are coming across here. Next thing that I thought about these and some of the other graphs is vertical reading. So as soon as you see charts like this, it quickly makes me want to do this. So I want to turn my head so I'm reading them in that left to right axis. And this is another thing that I see quite regularly going out to clients, is that they'll have graphs like this where the data is presented across horizontally, whereas usually, if at all possible, when you've got long axis titles, then I try to have them as what's sometimes referred to as a bar chart as opposed to a column chart. So going from left to right as opposed to up to down. So I was a bit torn about this one, and this one kind of comes back to the theory of data viz in general, is that it can be quite subjective, and different charts will mean different things to different people. But I took a go at removing the data inc on this, putting it into Tableau, getting the cases. And I, in this case, removed all of the, I kept all of the extra text around the outside, but I removed the grid lines, I removed the axis labels, and I translated the numbers to being, instead of vertically read, horizontally read. And so it's something that you can do to your charts whenever you've got grid lines, excess things that take up a lot of space and a lot of concentration on your page. Then really dumbing them down can make visualizations appear more aesthetically pleasing and allow the user to actually really concentrate on the data as opposed to all of the distractions that go around that. Last thing in this section, we're just going to have a very quick chat about some fonts. So a lot of the time you'll have in your company a specific font that you stick to, that you use all the time. But I just want to talk a little bit about what different fonts can mean to different people and how they can be used in data viz to really create a feeling of a particular topic or a particular context. So this is a relatively standard font. I think this is Arial, and it's a plain font. It's something that you use quite regularly. It doesn't really attract much attention. You'll be very much focusing on the text, what it's saying, as opposed to drawing any kind of different understanding from it. This one, to me, and this means different things to different people. To me, this is kind of a typewriter style font. To me, this is something that I would associate with maybe an old military film, with something that comes from a broadsheet newspaper from quite a long time ago. But if you're using a font like this, straight away, the person that is reading the text will have, well, for most cases, a similar connotation to what is intended, especially if you're adding other things to your visualizations that make them feel like that is the context. This one, I think this one's called Chalk Duster. This one makes me think of school blackboards, yeah, teaching, that kind of stuff. So again, thinking about the font, if you're using it in that context, if you're maybe putting together a fun visualization for a school, something that's going to be shown within the school, a weekly report, that kind of thing, especially if your audience is going to be kids, then this is a nice font to use. And then finally, this one's actually the one that I use for all of my sports code work. It's Century Gothic, and it is a bit more of a designy font. It kind of suggests that so it's still relatively clean, but it's also allowing people to feel like it's quite well polished, quite well thought out, and so it's a standard font without being Arial, without being Calibri. It's just got a little bit more rounding to it, and therefore that tends to be why I like to use it for my sports.